Welcome to the History Maps podcast.
Let's just dive right in.
Yeah, so consider a moment in 1907.
Okay.
You have this unelected 70-year-old private citizen who has literally locked the nation's most powerful bankers in the library of his New York mansion.
Right. He just refused to let them leave.
Exactly. He wouldn't unlock the doors until they committed millions of their own dollars to stop this cascading financial panic. A panic that was actively threatening to tear down the entire United States economy.
And that 70-year-old was J.P. Morgan.
Yeah, J.P. Morgan himself. And the fact that the nation had to rely on a single aging financier to act as its financial savior, it really exposed a terrifying fragility in the system.
It absolutely did.
So today, we're undertaking a comprehensive deep dive into the history of banking in the United States. This is part of our economic history series.
Right, and we have a vast collection of sources for this one.
We really do. The mission here is to examine how this nation went from financing a revolution with, depreciating paper and colonial land banks, all the way to the highly complex, centralized financial system we know today.
It is quite the journey for you as the listener. We have a highly structured path through the panics, the politics, and the consumer shifts that built the American economy.
You will see how the physical reality of money and trust and credit fundamentally evolved over 2 centuries.
And why the arguments happening today about things like cryptocurrency and digital banking are, in many ways, the exact same arguments Americans were having in the 1830s.
Right. Before we get into the timeline, what is the core theme we need to establish from the sources?
Well, the central theme is that American banking history is not this steady upward climb toward centralization.
It's not a straight line.
Not at all. Instead, it is a perpetual pendulum swing.
A pendulum swing between what exactly?
Between two extremes. On one side, you have this intense desire for centralized stability. People want a steady hand on the economic wheel that can prevent the kind of chaos that J.P. Morgan had to stop in 1907.
Right, the desire for order.
Exactly. But on the other side, there is a deep, almost instinctual fear of concentrated financial power.
Which is deeply ingrained in American political culture.
Yes. There is a profound suspicion of allowing a small group of elites to control the money supply of a democratic nation. So understanding this constant push and pull, this tension between economic stability and the democratic fear of financial monopoly is totally essential to understanding the American economic system you interact with today.
Okay, let's start by setting the scene where that tension first truly manifested on a national scale.
Let's do it.
It is 1781. The Continental Army is struggling.
The American Revolution is definitely not fully secured yet.
No. And the existing currency, the Continental dollar, is completely collapsing.
Yeah.
People are literally using the phrase "not worth a continental" in their daily lives.
Just to describe something entirely devoid of value.
Right. The inflation is rampant because the Continental Congress, well, they lacked the direct power to tax the colonies.
So they just simply printed paper money to pay for the war.
Exactly, without any hard assets backing it. It took wagon loads of paper currency just to buy a barrel of flour.
It was a total crisis.
And into this void steps Robert Morris. He was a wealthy Philadelphia merchant who becomes the superintendent of finance.
And he proposes something that had never existed in America.
At a national commercial bank. He called it the Bank of North America.
Right. So it was chartered by the Congress of the Confederation on May 26, 1781.
And it officially opened its doors in Philadelphia in January 1782.
The specifics of Morris's proposal are really vital to understand here because they set the template for early American banking.
What were the numbers like?
Well, Morris set the capital stock at $400,000.
Okay.
And that was divided into 1,000 shares, which were priced at $400 each.
Okay, let's unpack this. The country is actively at war against the British Empire. The existing paper currency is a public joke, and the national government is effectively bankrupt.
Right.
How did a brand new, cash-strapped nation convince anyone, let alone private citizens, to buy shares in a completely untested bank at $400 apiece?
Because that was an astronomical sum for a normal person in 1781.
Exactly. How did he pull that off?
Well, that is where Robert Morris's specific financial mechanics come into play. He understood that the only way to create trust in a new currency was to back it with something universally valued.
So he couldn't just use more paper.
No, he utilized specie.
Specie meaning hard currency, right?
Specifically, physical gold and silver coins. Morris managed to secure French loans.
Oh, right, from the French alliance.
Yeah, and a French frigate literally arrived in Boston carrying chests of silver.
Actual chests of silver.
Physical chests. And Morris had that silver transported by ox cart all the way down to Philadelphia.
Just to meet the initial subscription requirements for the government's portion of the bank's stock.
Exactly.
So he essentially used foreign silver to capitalize a domestic bank.
Yes. And furthermore, Morris personally leveraged his own considerable influence, reputation, and wealth to secure confidence in the venture.
Because if the superintendent of finance believes in it,
Other wealthy merchants might too. And because the bank now had a reserve of actual French silver in its vaults, it could issue paper banknotes that people actually trusted.
because they knew it wasn't just empty paper.
Right. If you held a banknote from the Bank of North America, you knew you could walk into their office in Philadelphia and exchange it for physical silver.
And because the public trusted the notes, the bank was able to create credit. The sources show it provided over $1.1 million in loans to the government.
That included 4 initial 6-month loans of $100,000 each at 6% interest.
And those loans were not just abstract numbers on a ledger. This funding was critical for physical military supplies, logistics, and payroll.
Especially for the Yorktown campaign.
Yes, specifically the intricate logistics required for the Yorktown siege, moving troops and artillery southward. And Yorktown was the battle that effectively broke the British resolve and won the war.
So, in a very real sense, this early banking mechanism secured American independence.
It really did. Now, the sources mentioned the bank discounted government securities and bills of exchange, which stabilized the flow of credit.
Yeah, that was its primary function for merchants.
Let me stop you there and ask for some clarification on the terminology. What exactly does it mean to discount a bill of exchange in the context of an 18th century economy?
That's a great point. We need to make sure the mechanics are entirely clear.
Because it sounds a bit technical.
It does, but it's actually quite simple. A bill of exchange was essentially a formal IOU used in trade.
Okay.
Say a merchant in Philadelphia ships flour to a buyer in the Caribbean. The buyer gives the merchant a bill of exchange promising to pay in 90 days.
But the Philadelphia merchant needs cash today to pay his suppliers.
Exactly. He can't wait 90 days. So he takes that bill to the Bank of North America. The bank buys the bill from him, but at a discount, meaning they pay him slightly less than the face value of the bill. Then the bank waits the 90 days and collects the full amount from the Caribbean buyer, keeping the difference as their profit.
So this process injects immediate liquidity or spendable cash into the local economy.
Right. It allows trade to continue moving rather than stalling while people wait for debts to clear.
That makes perfect sense. It turns future promises into present cash.
Exactly.
But almost immediately after the war ends, we see that pendulum swing you mentioned earlier.
The backlash.
Right. By 1785, radical agrarian factions within the state of Pennsylvania successfully revoked the bank's state charter.
We have to look closely at the arguments on both sides of this divide, as they represent the fundamental political economy debate of the early republic.
Let's lay out those arguments neutrally. What was the agrarian position?
The agrarian factions, which represented Western farmers and rural interests, argued that the bank held monopoly privileges that only benefited urban elites in Philadelphia.
Because they were dealing with a post-war economic downturn.
Yes, farmers were really struggling to find hard cash. They were deeply concerned that the strict collection of debts by the bank, which demanded payment in hard currency, was placing undue burdens on them.
They viewed the bank as this aristocratic institution squeezing the common man.
Right. But on the other hand, the urban financiers, merchants, and creditors argued that a central financial institution was strictly necessary.
Necessary to provide credit stability and a reliable medium of exchange.
Yes. They viewed the bank's strict lending and collection practices not as an elite monopoly, but as the fundamental discipline required to prevent a return to the hyperinflation of the continental dollar.
They believed that without a strong bank enforcing contracts, the economy would just collapse into barter and chaos.
Ultimately, the Pennsylvania General Assembly did side with the agrarians and revoke the state charter in 1785.
Though the bank did manage to continue operating under its original congressional charter for a while.
And later secured a Delaware charter before eventually getting its Pennsylvania charter restored with more restrictions.
What stands out to me in the sources is that this localized tension in Pennsylvania was merely a dress rehearsal.
Oh, absolutely.
The fierce debate over the Bank of North America foreshadowed the massive, nation-defining constitutional showdown that would occur just a few years later on the national stage.
Which brings us to the year 1791 and the establishment of the first Bank of the United States.
Alexander Hamilton's big project.
Right. Hamilton, serving as the first Secretary of the Treasury under President George Washington, heavily champions this institution.
He drafts this comprehensive financial plan for the new nation, and National Bank is its centerpiece.
Congress charters it with $10 million in capital.
Which, again, is a massive, unprecedented sum for the American economy at that time.
To put it in perspective, the entire federal budget was a fraction of that $10 million.
The structure is interesting, too. The federal government owned 20% of the shares, and private investors, including many Europeans, own the remaining 80%.
Yes. And the sources outline that the first bank acted as the fiscal agent for the federal government.
But let's clarify what that actually means operationally. In a world without the internet or wire transfers, how did a national bank actually function?
It functioned as the physical and administrative backbone of the government's finances.
Okay, so what did they do day to day?
Well, it collected tax revenues from various port cities, primarily customs duties. It secured the government's funds in its physical vaults. And most crucially, it transferred government deposits across its branch network.
The branch network is key.
Yes. If the government collected taxes in Boston but needed to pay troops down in Georgia, they no longer had to endure the physical risk and immense cost of moving heavy chests of gold by carriage over terrible dirt roads.
Which was incredibly dangerous.
Highly dangerous. The bank could handle it through ledger entries between its different branches.
It also managed the Treasury's interest payments to European investors who held U.S. government debt from the war.
Exactly.
I think of the first bank as a massive central clearinghouse for the young nation's economy. It provided a reliable, uniform currency that was accepted from Massachusetts to South Carolina, and it facilitated interstate trade.
It was very effective at those specific goals.
But if it was empirically working to stabilize the economy, why was the political resistance so fierce? I mean, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison vehemently opposed it from the very beginning.
They did. They argued it favored northern commercial elites and harbored dangerous foreign influence since European investors held a large portion of the private shares.
And the opposition remained so intense that when the bank's 20-year charter came up for renewal, Congress just let it expire in 1811.
By a single tie-breaking vote in the Senate.
Right. So why dismantle a functioning economic engine over political ideology?
This raises an important question regarding early American political philosophy. The answer lies in the fundamental disagreement over how to read the newly ratified Constitution.
This is where we get the strict versus loose interpretation debate.
Exactly. This debate over the first bank birthed that entire concept. Jefferson and Madison argued for strict construction.
Meaning they only wanted to do exactly what the text said.
Right. They looked at Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, which explicitly lists the enumerated powers of Congress, such as the power to coin money, declare war, and regulate commerce.
And they noted that the specific power to charter a corporation, let alone a national bank, is nowhere to be found in that text.
Hamilton, conversely, argued for loose construction. He relied on the necessary and proper clause at the very end of Article 1, Section 8.
Which states that Congress can make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution its enumerated powers.
Right. So Hamilton argued that a bank was a necessary and proper instrument to execute the government's explicit powers to collect taxes, borrow money, and support armies.
But for the Democratic Republicans, led by Jefferson and Madison, the empirical fiscal benefits of the bank, like the stable currency or the efficient transfer of funds, were distinctly less important than the perceived threat of federal overreach and centralized wealth.
They feared that a powerful national bank, intertwined with the government and wealthy private elites, would inevitably corrupt the legislature.
They believed it would erode state sovereignty and basically turn the agrarian republic into a European-style financial oligarchy.
Yes.
But the timing of the bank's closure in 1811 proved to be a logistical nightmare.
The worst possible timing.
The charter expires, the bank is liquidated, its hard currency is shipped back to European investors, and almost immediately the United States enters the War of 1812 against Great Britain.
So the country suddenly found itself fighting a major naval and land war without a central financial mechanism.
Without a national bank to act as a fiscal agent and a unified lender to the government, Financing the military operations became incredibly difficult.
The credit and borrowing status of the U.S. Treasury hit its absolute lowest point. They had to rely on a patchwork of high-interest loans from private individuals.
And to fill the immense void left by the first bank, individual state legislatures started chartering their own state-level banks at a rapid pace.
Very rapid. The sources show over 200 state-chartered banks springing up in just a few years.
And because there is this massive demand for money to fund the war economy, these state banks all start issuing their own paper notes.
But here's the critical failure point.
Yeah.
Because there is no central institution presenting these notes for redemption in gold or silver to keep them in check, the state banks begin issuing far more paper money than they actually have specie in their vaults to back it up.
The result was entirely predictable.
It led to severe inflation and currency depreciation across the entire country.
It culminated in a widespread suspension of specie payments by most state banks outside of New England in August 1814.
Which meant the banks simply locked their doors and refused to hand over gold or silver in exchange for their paper notes.
The government was trying to conduct a war, but the system was deeply fractured.
A federal tax collector might receive state banknotes in Virginia, but those notes were often heavily discounted or entirely worthless when the government tried to use them to buy gunpowder or uniforms up in Massachusetts.
The financial chaos was so profound, and the inability to move funds so crippling, that it forced a major political realignment on the issue.
It is a striking historical pivot.
Yeah, even James Madison, who is now president, the very man who had so fiercely opposed the first bank alongside Jefferson on strict constitutional grounds, reluctantly supported the creation of a new national bank.
The brutal empirical reality of wartime finance simply overrode his earlier theoretical objections.
So in 1816, the Second Bank of the United States was chartered.
It was designed similarly to the first, but on a much grander scale. It had $35 million in capital.
And the government again retained a 20% ownership stake.
Right. And the president appointed 5 of the 25 directors. It eventually opened 25 branches nationwide.
Effectively serving as a massive interstate branch banking system.
Yes.
Now, the second bank essentially functioned like the first in terms of clearing government funds and providing a uniform currency. But it also set the stage for one of the most dramatic political and economic conflicts in American history.
The Bank War.
Yes, the Bank War. This conflict features 2 towering, inflexible figures. On one side, we have Nicholas Biddle, the aristocratic, highly educated, and highly capable president of the Second Bank.
And on the other side is President Andrew Jackson, representing a fierce populist resistance. He viewed the bank as a corrupting monster.
To understand the Bank War, we need to carefully examine the mechanics of how the Second Bank exerted its power over the economy, which is precisely what Jackson was reacting to.
Right. So the Second Bank received all the federal government's tax deposits, mostly from land sales and customs duties. Because citizens often paid these taxes using the diverse banknotes issued by various state banks, the Second Bank continually accumulated massive quantities of state bank currency.
And Nicholas Biddle utilized this accumulated paper as a potent regulatory tool.
Precisely. Biddle acted as a de facto central banker. If he felt a particular state bank was issuing too much paper money and lending too recklessly, inflating a local bubble, he would take action.
Well, what do you do?
He would take a stack of that bank's notes, present them to the state bank, and demand physical gold and silver.
Calling their bluff, essentially.
Exactly. This constant threat of redemption forced the state banks to keep larger, safer reserves of specie in their vaults, which naturally limited how much paper money they could print and lend.
Which provided excellent currency stability across the nation.
It did, but it also meant that Nicholas Biddle, an unelected private citizen sitting in Philadelphia, held enormous discretionary power over the entire nation's credit supply.
Which brings us to the climax of the conflict. In 1832, Biddle and his political allies pushed a bill through Congress to recharter the Second Bank 4 years early.
Specifically to make it an issue in the upcoming presidential election.
And Andrew Jackson promptly vetoed the bill. The arguments presented by both sides really define the era.
Jackson's famous veto message argued that the bank was fundamentally unconstitutional and represented an unacceptable concentration of power in the hands of a few private elite citizens who were unaccountable to the electorate.
He argued it was a threat to state sovereignty, a machine for political corruption, and that it enriched foreign stockholders and northeastern elites at the direct expense of everyday farmers and mechanics.
But Biddle and the bank's supporters in Congress, notably Henry Clay and Daniel Webster, argued that the bank's regulatory capacity was absolutely essential for a developing nation.
They pointed to the stable, uniform currency, the reliability of the credit markets, and the highly efficient management of public debt.
They argued that the institution had proven its worth over 16 years.
They warned that without the second bank maintaining discipline, the country would inevitably revert to the disastrous inflation, local banking chaos, and currency depreciation seen during the War of 1812.
But Jackson decisively won the political battle, winning re-election in a landslide.
And he did not just wait for the charter to expire in 1836. He actively sought to destroy the bank.
Right. He ordered the Secretary of the Treasury to withdraw the federal government's deposits from the second bank.
And place them where?
In selected politically aligned state institutions, which his critics quickly dubbed pet banks.
The removal of those federal deposits fundamentally stripped the second bank of its regulatory capacity.
Without the constant inflow of government revenue, Biddle no longer had the leverage to accumulate state banknotes and discipline the state banks.
So the second bank lost its national reach and was eventually reduced to operating as a mere state-chartered entity under the laws of Pennsylvania,
before ultimately failing a few years later.
Jackson's victory created a massive regulatory vacuum in the United States economy. The federal government explicitly stepped back from managing the national currency and regulating credit.
And if Washington wasn't going to do it, the individual states were going to step in.
This political shift leads us directly into the period known as the free banking era, which ran roughly from 1837 through to the Civil War in 1863.
Now, the term free banking can be slightly misleading. It does not mean banking was free from rules.
What does it mean then?
It refers to the easing of entry barriers. Prior to this era, opening a bank required a specific individual act of a state legislature to grant a corporate charter.
Which sounds incredibly cumbersome.
It was, and it often involved intense lobbying, political favoritism, and outright bribery. The party in power would charter banks for their friends and deny charters to their political enemies.
So, to eliminate that corruption, states started changing the laws. Michigan in 1837 and New York in 1838 passed general incorporation laws for banks.
These laws allowed anyone or any group of investors to start a bank, provided they met specific, standardized capital requirements and followed a specific regulatory mechanism.
What was the core rule?
The core rule was that a new bank had to purchase state government bonds and deposit those bonds with the state auditor as collateral for the paper banknotes they wished to issue.
Now, this era is intensely famous in American financial folklore for the concept of the wildcat bank.
Yes, the traditional historical narrative paints a picture of unscrupulous swindlers setting up banks in remote, inaccessible areas.
Out deep in the forests where the wildcats roamed.
Right.
The idea being that these swindlers would issue a massive amount of paper banknotes, travel to a city to spend them or trade them for goods. But because the physical bank was in the middle of a swamp, no one holding the notes could realistically travel there to redeem the paper for gold or silver.
Thus, the bankers enriched themselves on fraudulent paper.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Is that story actually true? Were these banks truly just reckless scams?
Well, that is the story that has been told for a century. However, the sources indicate that this traditional narrative of widespread, deliberate wildcat banking is largely a myth.
A myth.
Yes. Modern economists and financial historians have deeply re-examined the surviving data from this era.
And what did they find?
While some fraudulent operations certainly existed, primarily in sparsely populated frontier territories like early Michigan, where oversight was virtually non-existent, they were the exception rather than the rule.
Okay, let me stop you there, because that contradicts everything we're typically taught about this era.
It does.
If these free banks were not all just reckless scams run by frontier conmen, what was actually happening when they failed? Because many of them did fail, right?
The failure rates of free banks were indeed high in certain years, but overall they were actually comparable to the failure rates of banks in other heavily regulated periods. Yes. Comprehensive studies of the banking records in states like New York, Wisconsin, and Indiana show that when free banks closed their doors, it was rarely due to deliberate fraud or a wildcat scheme to evade redemption.
Then what caused it?
It was most often due to exogenous shocks.
For the sake of clarity, An exogenous shock means a massive outside force impacting the economy, something entirely beyond the individual banker's control.
Exactly. Remember the core mechanism of the free banking system we just discussed. The banknotes were backed by state bonds held by the state auditor in the capital.
Right, the bond collateral.
Yes. So if a bank in Buffalo wanted to issue $100,000 in paper notes, it had to buy $100,000 worth of New York State bonds and physically deposit them with the state controller.
And the bank would earn the interest on the bonds, and the public could trust the notes because they were backed by government debt.
But the fatal flaw in that system is that the prices of those state bonds fluctuated heavily on the open market.
Ah, I see.
Many states in the 1830s and 40s issued massive amounts of bonds to finance large infrastructure projects, primarily canals and early railroads.
So if a major railroad project went bankrupt, or if the broader economy dipped in a recession, the value of those state bonds plunged.
Suddenly, the bank in Buffalo, which had done nothing fraudulent, was massively undercapitalized.
The bonds backing their currency were no longer worth the face value of the notes in circulation.
Right. And if a panic started and depositors rushed to redeem their notes for specie, the bank would have to close.
The collateral backing the currency simply evaporated due to broader market forces.
Yes. And here is a crucial detail that further debunks the wildcat myth. When a free bank failed due to these bond price drops, the losses to the average citizens holding their notes were often significantly mitigated.
Because the state still held the bonds.
Exactly. The state comptroller held the collateralized bonds. The state would sell those bonds on the open market and use the proceeds to pay off the people holding the failed bank's notes.
The data shows that note holders in failing free banking institutions typically recovered the vast majority of their money, often 70 to 90 cents on the dollar, depending on the state.
Furthermore, the free market itself evolved to impose strict discipline on the system.
Right. With the federal government out of the picture, there were eventually over 8,000 different types of state banknotes floating around the United States economy.
Issued by thousands of different free banks and chartered banks.
It sounds like absolute chaos. How did a shopkeeper in Ohio conduct daily business if someone handed them a note from a bank in Pennsylvania they had never heard of?
They relied on private market solutions, specifically note detectors.
More of those.
These were essentially thick, regularly published manuals, periodicals that merchants kept right on their counters.
Like a catalog of money.
Exactly. A note detector listed almost every bank in the country, detailed whether it was solvent, described what its genuine notes look like to prevent counterfeiting, and, most importantly, listed the discount rate for that bank's notes.
So if a merchant looked at the detector, it might say a $1 note from a highly reputable bank in Boston was worth exactly $1.
Right.
But a note from a newer bank in rural Illinois was only worth 90 cents in trade.
Because the discount reflected the cost and risk of transporting that note back to its home bank to get the gold.
The distance from the issuing bank and the reputation of the bank's managers determined the value of the currency in real time.
Additionally, private clearinghouses emerged, such as the Suffolk system in New England, where city banks banded together to systematically collect country banknotes and send them back for redemption.
Keeping the rural banks honest and their note issues restrained.
Exactly. The system functioned remarkably well on a local and regional level, relying on asset-backed note issuance and private market discipline rather than a monopoly central issuer.
People figured out how to make a highly decentralized system work.
They did.
However, having thousands of different currencies with fluctuating values, while manageable for local merchants with a note detector, was fundamentally incompatible with fighting a massive modern national war.
Which brings us to the outbreak of the American Civil War in 1861.
The fiscal demands of this conflict were unlike anything the nation had ever seen.
Raising massive armies, buying millions of rifles, manufacturing artillery, and supplying hundreds of thousands of troops across a continent forced the federal government's hand.
The decentralized, fractured state banking system simply could not absorb the massive amounts of debt the Union government needed to issue to survive.
Secretary of the Treasury Salmon P. Chase needed a unified system to sell war bonds.
This urgent need leads to the passage of the National Banking Acts of 1863 and 1864.
These acts fundamentally restructured American finance and established elements of the regulatory framework we still use today.
They created the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, or the OCC, situated within the Treasury Department.
And the OCC was authorized to issue national charters to newly formed national banks.
The mechanism established here is crucial, as it mirrors the free banking laws, but on a federal level.
Yes, to receive a charter and issue a new uniform national banknote, these new national banks were required to purchase United States government bonds.
They deposited those U.S. bonds with the Treasury in Washington.
And in return, the Treasury provided them with beautifully engraved uniform national currency up to 90% of the value of the bonds they deposited.
This was a stroke of administrative genius for a nation at war. It accomplished two vital wartime goals simultaneously.
First, by requiring banks to buy U.S. bonds to issue money, it created a massive, captive, guaranteed market for Union government debt, providing the cash needed to fund the Army.
And second, it provided a stable, uniform national currency to replace the chaotic patchwork of 8,000 different state notes.
A national banknote looked the same and held the same value whether you were in Maine or California.
But there was a problem. The state banks were still operating alongside the new national banks, and they were still issuing their own local notes.
The state banks didn't want to convert to national charters because the national capital requirements and reserve rules were much stricter.
To truly create a uniform currency and force the banks into the national system, the federal government had to eliminate the competition.
So in 1865, Congress levied a 10% tax specifically on the payout of state banknotes.
10% is an enormous tax on money itself.
It's massive.
If a bank issues a $1 note and has to pay a 10-cent tax every time it circulates, the profit margin vanishes entirely.
The tax was not designed to raise revenue. It was deliberately designed to tax state currencies out of existence.
And it worked exactly as intended. The state banknotes quickly became unprofitable to issue and rapidly vanished from circulation, replaced entirely by the new national banknotes and government-issued greenbacks.
But this raises a fascinating question about institutional survival.
Right. If their primary product, the physical currency they issued and profited from, was taxed out of existence, how did state banks survive at all? Why didn't they all just convert to national charters or go bankrupt?
This is a pivotal moment in banking history because it birthed the dual banking system that defines the United States today, where both state-chartered and federally chartered banks operate side by side.
So how do they adapt?
The state banks survived by innovating. Instead of focusing on issuing physical paper notes to lend money, they shifted their focus to a financial technology that was becoming increasingly popular: checking accounts.
Also known as demand deposits.
Yes. They realized they did not need to print physical currency if they could create credit through ledger entries.
If a businessman needed a loan, the state bank didn't hand him a stack of notes. They simply credited his account with a balance, and he could write checks against it to pay his suppliers.
It is a profound pivot from physical money to ledger money.
The state banks found that operating with checks was cheaper, and because state regulations were generally looser than the new national regulations, they could offer more flexible lending terms.
But while the banking structure adapted, the new national currency system had a significant, dangerous structural flaw.
What was the flaw?
The new national currency was uniform, and it was exceptionally safe because it was backed by U.S. bonds, but it was incredibly rigid.
Let me offer an analogy from the sources to explain this because it is central to understanding the economic panics that followed. The concept is an inelastic currency.
Okay, let's hear it.
Imagine a municipal water system for a large city. The pipes are fixed in size, constructed from rigid iron. The water pressure coming from the reservoir is steady, but it cannot be rapidly adjusted.
Right.
In the spring, the flow is perfectly adequate. But in the peak of summer, when every single household turns on their sprinklers at exactly the same time, the pressure drops precipitously across the entire city. The system cannot expand its capacity to meet a sudden, massive spike in demand. The pipes cannot stretch.
That is an exceptionally apt comparison for the national banking era. The supply of national banknotes was tied strictly to the amount of U.S. government bonds held by the banks.
So the money supply was not tied to the actual fluctuating demands of the broader commercial economy.
In the late 19th century, the American economy was still heavily agricultural.
Which meant seasonal demands.
Exactly. Every fall during the harvest season, millions of farmers needed physical cash at exactly the same time to pay temporary harvest workers and pay the railroads to move crops to market.
The demand for physical currency spiked dramatically, just like everyone turning on their sprinklers.
But the national banks could not just print more notes to meet this seasonal demand. They were capped by the strict limits of their U.S. bond holdings.
This inflexibility would regularly cause severe seasonal liquidity crunches.
Physical cash would drain out of the eastern city banks and move to the rural west and south.
This sudden scarcity of money in the financial centers drove up interest rates astronomically and strained the entire financial system, making it incredibly vulnerable to panic.
It was a very precarious setup.
As the currency stabilized in the decades following the Civil War, the American industrial machine roared to life. We moved rapidly from a rural, agrarian society to a massive industrial powerhouse.
Railroads crossed the continent, steel mills lit up the night, and cities exploded in population.
And this created a fundamentally new kind of economy, one that profoundly altered how everyday Americans interacted with money, debt, and credit.
To understand this shift, we must look at how the physical reality of material life changed. The sources detail a fascinating virtual museum exhibit that perfectly illustrates this evolution in consumer credit.
Let's walk through that exhibit because it makes the macroeconomics very personal.
Okay, set the scene.
Picture a typical New England family home in 1810.
1810.
The display of their possessions is austere and highly utilitarian. Their material life is defined by heavy iron tools, wooden farm implements, basic cooking utensils, and a chamber pot.
Very basic necessities.
There are almost no leisure items, perhaps just a family Bible and a simple hand-carved children's toy. Life was heavily focused on agricultural production and basic survival.
And in this society, borrowing money was viewed through a very strict moral lens.
In the early 19th century, borrowing was generally considered acceptable only when the funds were used to acquire productive assets.
Right. A farmer could morally and economically justify borrowing against his expected autumn harvest to buy seed for the spring or to purchase adjacent land to increase his crop yield. The debt paid for itself.
However, borrowing for consumption, taking on debt for luxury items, finer clothes, or non-essentials, was widely viewed as financially imprudent and socially immoral.
Credit was highly local, deeply personal, and intimately tied to the agricultural cycle. The local storekeeper extended a line of credit for sugar and nails based on his personal knowledge of the farmer's character and work ethic.
Now let's move the museum exhibit forward 80 years to 1890.
The change is visually stark.
You see factory-made consumer goods filling the home. You see a large parlor organ in the corner, a decorative glass table lamp, manufactured carpets, and upholstered furniture.
The Industrial Revolution has created an astonishing variety of new, desirable products, and millions of people have moved to cities, earning steady cash wages in factories and offices instead of waiting for a yearly crop payout.
But these new manufactured products were expensive. A working class or even middle class family could not afford to pull together the cash up front for a parlor organ.
The social and moral barriers against consumer borrowing began to erode rapidly because the intense desire for what became known as the American standard of living required it. People wanted the trappings of middle-class respectability.
A perfect specific example detailed in the sources is the Singer sewing machine company in the 1850s and 60s.
The sewing machine was a revolutionary labor-saving device for the home, but it cost roughly $100.
At that time, the average industrial worker made under $500 in an entire year.
Paying cash for a machine that cost a fifth of their annual income was simply impossible for most families.
So, to sell their machines, Singer introduced and popularized the installment plan.
A customer would make a small cash down payment and then sign a contract agreeing to pay a fixed number of equal monthly payments with interest until the machine was paid off.
And if they missed a payment, the company would repossess the machine.
What's fascinating here is how the massive macroeconomic structure of banking had to physically shift to accommodate the microeconomic realities of daily life.
Exactly. For centuries, credit risk was assessed by a local storekeeper looking a farmer in the eye. As the economy industrialized and urbanized, credit risk had to be formalized and institutionalized.
Providing installment credit for millions of manufactured goods required banks and finance companies to allocate capital entirely differently.
They had to develop mechanisms for assessing the risk of anonymous wage earners living in crowded cities, relying on actuarial tables and employment verification rather than personal reputation and the weather.
Let's finish the museum tour to see where this led. We move to the 1960s display.
It is overflowing with consumer goods. It is filled with golf clubs, a reel-to-reel tape recorder, a television set, fiberglass skis, and a fondue pot.
Almost none of it is strictly essential for basic survival. It is all focused on leisure and convenience.
Consumer credit through department store charge cards, auto loans, and eventually credit cards had become completely normalized, stripped of its old moral stigma.
The transition from the local storekeeper's ledger to mass installment credit reflects a massive ongoing evolution in financial innovation.
However, while these consumer goods were improving the daily material life of Americans at the turn of the 20th century, the rigid, inelastic currency system we discussed earlier, the inflexible water pipes, was creating massive widening fault lines in the broader economy.
Those fault lines ruptured repeatedly and violently during the Gilded Age.
We see severe, devastating economic panics in 1873 and 1893, leading to widespread unemployment and railroad bankruptcies.
But the defining moment, the crisis that finally forced a change, was the Panic of 1907.
Let's get into 1907.
The Panic of 1907 was a profound crisis that began in the United States and rippled outward. We need to detail the specific trigger of this panic because it illustrates the complex, interconnected nature of Wall Street.
In October of that year, two speculators and financiers, F. Augustus Heinz and Charles W. Morse, attempted to pull off a highly aggressive maneuver known as cornering the market in the stock of the United Copper Company.
Let's explain what cornering a market entails. Heinz and Morse attempted to secretly buy up a massive majority of the available shares of United Copper.
Once they owned almost all the stock, they could dictate the price.
Anyone who had bet against the stock short sellers would be forced to buy the shares back from Heinz and Morse at whatever extortionate price they demanded.
But to pull this off, Heinz and Morse had to borrow immense sums of money from banks to buy the initial shares.
It was a high-wire act, and their scheme failed spectacularly. They ran out of money before they could secure the corner.
When the market realized the corner had failed, the artificially inflated price collapsed. Over a few days, the stock of United Copper plunged from $39.75 a share down to $10.
That catastrophic collapse wiped out Heinz and Morse personally, but the real danger was the economic contagion that followed.
Heinz and Morse were not just isolated speculators. They were heavily involved in the management and ownership of several New York City financial institutions, particularly institutions known as trust companies.
We need to clearly differentiate what trust companies were in the 1907 ecosystem.
Right.
Trust companies functioned a lot like commercial banks. They took deposits from the public and made loans, but they were chartered by the state under different rules.
They were originally designed to manage estates and trusts for wealthy individuals, so they were largely unregulated compared to the national banks.
Crucially, because they were supposedly taking fewer risks, trust companies were only required by state law to hold about 5% of their deposits in physical cash reserves.
National banks, by contrast, were required to hold up to 25% in cash.
This is a classic case of regulatory arbitrage. Trust companies could lend out 95% of the money they took in, making massive profits during boom times, but it left them incredibly vulnerable to sudden withdrawals.
When the public read in the newspapers about Heinz's failure, panic immediately set in. Depositors realized that any institution associated with Heinz might have lent him money for his failed copper scheme, meaning the bank might be insolvent.
Depositors rationally rushed to pull their money out of Heinz's banks. And in a banking system built on fractional reserves, panic is highly contagious.
The fear quickly spread from Heinz's direct network to other trusts. The epicenter of the crisis rapidly shifted to the Knickerbocker Trust Company.
It was a massive institution, the third largest trust in New York City, holding over $52 million in deposits from ordinary citizens and businesses.
The president of the Knickerbocker had previous business dealings with Morse, and that tenuous connection was enough to trigger a run.
In a single day, terrified depositors lined up down the street and pulled $8 million in physical cash out of the Knickerbocker.
With only a small percentage of reserves on hand, the Knickerbocker was forced to suspend operations. It simply ran out of physical cash in its vaults and closed its ornate bronze doors.
Once the mighty Knickerbocker fell, the contagion was entirely uncontained. Runs spread rapidly across the city to the Trust Company of America and the Lincoln Trust. People were hoarding gold and currency.
And here is where the inelastic national currency, the rigid water pipe, turned a localized banking panic into a national crisis.
The national banks could not expand the money supply to meet the frantic public demand for cash. Interior banks across the country, seeing the chaos in New York, demanded their reserve funds back from the city banks, draining millions more in cash away from Wall Street. Credit froze entirely.
The New York Stock Exchange faced total collapse because the banks suddenly refused to offer call money.
Call money is the crucial lubricant of the stock exchange. It is a system of short-term loans given to stockbrokers so they can buy stocks on margin.
If the banks call those loans in or refuse to issue new ones, brokers are forced to immediately sell all their stocks to raise cash, which causes the entire market to crash.
During the panic, the interest rate on call money spiked to an unbelievable 70%. There was simply no money available to lend.
With the federal government lacking a central bank to act as a lender of last resort, a single private citizen stepped into the breach. J.P. Morgan, the immensely powerful 70-year-old titan of finance, personally took control of the situation from his library on Madison Avenue.
Morgan acted with the authority of an unelected central banker. He organized syndicates of other prominent bankers.
When the president of the New York Stock Exchange came to Morgan and said the exchange would have to close early because there was zero money available, Morgan knew that closing the exchange would destroy global confidence in America.
Within minutes, Morgan convinced the city's top bankers to pledge $25 million, injecting it directly into the exchange to keep it open.
He arranged a massive $30 million rescue for the Trust Company of America, dispatching his own accountants to verify their assets before committing the funds.
And the most famous incident of the panic, when the crisis flared up again days later regarding the potential collapse of a major brokerage firm, Morgan literally locked a group of the city's most prominent trust company presidents in his private library.
He put the key in his pocket and refused to let them leave until they agreed to subscribe $25 million to a rescue fund.
Exhausted, they finally signed the agreement at 5 in the morning.
So what does this all mean? If J.P. Morgan successfully fixed it, if he saved the trusts, saved the stock exchange, and even saved the city of New York from defaulting on its municipal bonds, why was everyone so terrified in the aftermath? Why is this panic considered the turning point in American financial history?
Because relying on a single private citizen who was aging and could not live forever to act as the lending of last resort was fundamentally unacceptable for an emerging global superpower.
Morgan's rescue was a tactical success, but it highlighted a massive strategic failure.
The panic caused deep, lasting economic damage. It caused a 10% drop in the nation's gross domestic product. Industrial production plummeted.
There was a staggering 47% spike in commercial bankruptcies nationwide.
The crisis definitively proved to politicians, businessmen, and the public alike that the national banking system, with its rigid, inelastic currency and fragmented, hoarded reserves, was dangerously inadequate for a modern, interconnected industrial economy.
This specific trauma finally broke the decades-long political deadlock. The ghost of Andrew Jackson's bank war had prevented any serious political discussion of establishing a central bank for over 70 years. But the terror of 1907 changed the calculus entirely.
The immediate legislative response from Congress was the Aldrich-Vreeland Act of 1908.
This act allowed groups of national banks to issue emergency currency during a crisis, a stopgap measure to add a little flexibility to the pipes.
More importantly, however, it created the National Monetary Commission, chaired by a powerful Republican, Senator Nelson Aldrich of Rhode Island.
The commission's mandate was to travel to Europe, study the central banking systems of England, Germany, and France, and propose a comprehensive overhaul of the American financial system.
And this leads us to one of the most famous, heavily scrutinized, and mythologized events in American banking history.
In November 1910, Senator Aldrich, Paul Warburg, a highly brilliant investment banker who deeply understood European central banking, and several other top Wall Street financiers gathered in extreme secrecy.
They traveled in a private rail car under the guise of a duck hunting trip to an exclusive, isolated private club on Jekyll Island off the coast of Georgia.
This secrecy was so intense that they strictly used only first names during the trip to prevent the train staff or the press from discovering who was assembling.
The intense secrecy was entirely driven by political reality. The American public, particularly in the South and West, was deeply historically suspicious of Wall Street, a suspicion magnified exponentially by the panic of 1907.
The architects of this meeting knew that if a plan for a new United States central bank appeared to be written by the nation's wealthiest private bankers in a smoke-filled room, it would be dead on arrival in the populist halls of Congress.
During that intensive week of drafting on Jekyll Island, they created the foundational framework that would eventually, after significant political modification under Woodrow Wilson's administration, become the Federal Reserve Act, signed into law in 1913.
To avoid the political pitfalls that destroyed the first and second banks of the United States, the fear of a monolithic, centralized financial monster situated in eastern cities, they designed a decentralized central bank.
Instead of one single institution in Philadelphia or New York, The Federal Reserve Act created 12 regional Federal Reserve banks scattered across the country in cities like Atlanta, St. Louis, and San Francisco.
These regional banks were overseen by a Federal Reserve Board situated in Washington.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the Federal Reserve was specifically designed to fix the exact structural failures exposed in 1907.
Exactly how?
First and foremost, it was designed to provide an elastic currency. The new Federal Reserve notes could expand and contract in volume based on the actual discount needs of a commercial economy, not just based on a fixed supply of government bonds.
It allowed the water pipes to expand during times of stress.
Second, it established a formal institutional lender of last resort. Through the discount window, banks facing a liquidity crisis could pledge their solid assets to the Fed in exchange for cash.
The country would never again have to rely on a private individual locking people in a library to stop a panic.
The complex 12-bank structure was an explicit political compromise intended to balance power between the financial elite of Wall Street, the agricultural and industrial interests of Main Street, and the political oversight of Washington.
The newly minted Federal Reserve was quickly put to the test, successfully managing the massive, unprecedented financing required for World War I without causing massive inflation. But when it faced its ultimate test, just over a decade later, the institution did not perform exactly as its architects had hoped.
The Great Depression of the 1930s exposed entirely new vulnerabilities in the global financial architecture.
Despite the existence of the Federal Reserve and its mandate to provide liquidity, the United States experienced three massive waves of catastrophic banking panics between 1930 and 1933.
These panics resulted in the failure or suspension of over 9,000 individual banks, wiping out the life savings of millions of Americans.
Let's dig into the mechanisms of that failure. The entire point of the Jekyll Island meeting and the Federal Reserve Act was to have a lender of last resort ready to pump cash into the system during a panic. Why didn't the Fed step in robustly and save those 9,000 banks?
The Federal Reserve's failure to act decisively was driven by a complex mix of poor economic theory, internal leadership struggles following the death of its dominant early leader Benjamin Strong, and, most critically, the constraints of the international gold standard.
We need to explain the gold standard constraint carefully because it is entirely counterintuitive to how we view modern monetary policy.
Under the rules of the gold standard operating at that time, the Federal Reserve was legally required to back a percentage of the currency it issued with physical gold in its vaults.
During the financial crises in 1931, after Great Britain shockingly abandoned the gold standard, terrified foreign investors and domestic citizens alike began hoarding physical gold, pulling it out of U.S. banks.
Gold was draining rapidly from the Federal Reserve's reserves.
So the Fed is losing the physical gold it needs to legally back the paper currency.
Exactly. To stop the outflow of gold, the standard monetary policy playbook of the era dictated that the central bank must raise interest rates.
Higher interest rates make holding deposits in the country more attractive to foreign investors, theoretically drawing gold back in.
So, in the midst of a catastrophic domestic banking panic, where banks desperately needed cheap liquidity to survive, the Federal Reserve actually raised interest rates significantly to protect the dollar's peg to gold.
They prioritized the international gold standard and the strength of the dollar over the survival of thousands of domestic banks and the millions of citizens who banked with them.
They actively tightened the money supply precisely when it needed to be loosened. It was a catastrophic policy failure that deepened the Depression immeasurably.
This immense suffering led directly to the massive regulatory overhaul of the New Deal under President Franklin D. Roosevelt.
The legislative response in 1933 was swift, aggressive, and profound.
The Emergency Banking Act stabilized the immediate panic through a national bank holiday, physically closing all banks until they could be inspected and certified as solvent.
The controversial abandonment of the domestic gold standard allowed the Federal Reserve to finally expand the money supply without worrying about gold outflows.
And eventually, the Banking Act of 1935 restructured the Federal Reserve System itself, centralizing much more power in the Board of Governors in Washington and significantly reducing the autonomy of the 12 regional reserve banks.
But the two most famous, lasting pieces of banking legislation from this era, the laws that reshaped the industry for the rest of the 20th century, are the Glass-Steagall Act of 1933 and the creation of the FDIC.
Let's start with Glass-Steagall. It mandated a strict, unbreachable legal wall separating commercial banking from investment banking.
Yes. Commercial banking involves taking routine deposits from the public and making standard loans to businesses and home buyers. Investment banking involves underwriting and dealing in stocks, corporate bonds, and corporate mergers activities, inherently involving much higher risk and speculation.
The logic of Glass-Steagall was straightforward. A bank holding the federally insured life savings of everyday Americans should not be permitted to gamble those crucial funds on Wall Street speculation.
If an investment bank makes a bad bet and fails, wealthy investors lose money. If a commercial bank gambles and fails, the entire payment system of the local community collapses.
And then there is the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the FDIC. How did the creation of the FDIC fundamentally change the psychology of the American depositor? Because up until this point, banking panic seemed like an unavoidable fact of nature.
The creation of the FDIC is arguably the most impactful psychological shift in financial history. Prior to 1933, as we saw in the free banking era and the panic of 1907, the safety of your deposited money relied entirely on the physical cash reserves in the bank's vault and the general public perception of the bank's solvency.
If a rumor started, even a completely false rumor, that a bank was failing due to bad loans, the only rational thing for a depositor to do was to run to the bank and get their money out first before the vault was empty.
Which, ironically, is exactly what causes the bank to fail, as we saw with the Knickerbocker Trust. The prophecy fulfills itself. The structure of the system made panics rational.
The FDIC fundamentally shifted that risk architecture. It provided a sovereign guarantee on individual deposits up to a certain limit.
It told the public, even if your specific bank goes entirely bankrupt due to the manager making terrible loans, the federal government guarantees you will get your insured money back.
By legally separating the fate of the individual consumer's deposit from the speculative risks taken by the bank, the FDIC effectively ended the era of widespread, devastating, psychologically driven bank runs in the commercial sector.
This New Deal framework, Glass-Steagall separating the risk, and the FDIC ensuring the deposits provided decades of relative stability in the financial sector.
We saw the massive post-World War II economic expansion, the establishment of the Bretton Woods system that cemented the U.S. dollar as a global reserve currency, and the steady rise of technological innovations like ATMs.
During this period, credit unions and savings and loan associations also expanded massively. They provided specialized mortgage and consumer lending that fueled the growth of the American suburbs and a growing middle class.
Banking was often described as a boring, predictable 3-6-3 business. Take in deposits at 3%, lend them out at 6%, and be on the golf course by 3 p.m.
However, as the world modernized in the late 20th century and finance became increasingly globalized and technologically complex, the strict, localized rules drafted during the crisis of the 1930s began to chafe against the realities of modern international markets.
The pendulum swings back yet again. Starting in the 1980s and accelerating rapidly through the 1990s, we see a massive wave of financial deregulation.
To understand this shift, we must look at the arguments driving it. Proponents of deregulation argued that American banks were losing their competitive edge to massive, universal foreign institutions, particularly in Europe and Japan, because U.S. banks were shackled by antiquated Depression-era laws.
They argued that lifting branching restrictions and allowing banks to offer a wider, integrated array of financial products, like insurance and securities underwriting, would lead to greater economic efficiency, more robust institutions, and lower costs for consumers.
Opponents of this movement argued that tearing down the firewalls of the New Deal, specifically Glass-Steagall, would inevitably invite unacceptable systemic risk back into the system.
They warned that allowing depository institutions to merge with investment banks would recreate the very conditions of speculative excess that led to the Great Depression.
The legislative results heavily favored deregulation. Restrictions on interstate banking were systematically lifted, allowing regional banks to operate across state lines and eventually build massive national footprints.
The Glass-Steagall Act was gradually eroded by regulatory loopholes and then fully officially repealed by the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act of 1999.
This repeal allowed the creation of massive financial conglomerates institutions that combined retail commercial banking, high-risk investment banking, and insurance underwriting under one gigantic corporate roof.
We saw early warnings of instability in the system with the savings and loan crisis in the late 80s, which cost taxpayers billions to clean up. But the era of deregulation culminated spectacularly in the 2008 global financial crisis.
The 2008 crisis was deeply rooted in the housing market, subprime lending, and incredibly complex financial engineering.
These newly permitted massive financial conglomerates had created intensely complicated instruments known as mortgage-backed securities.
We need to explain a mortgage-backed security simply. Instead of a local bank holding your mortgage for 30 years, Wall Street banks bought up thousands of individual home loans from across the country.
They bundled all these loans together into one massive package and then sold slices of that package to investors globally. If people paid their mortgages, the investors made money.
That is exactly how it functioned. But to keep the pipeline moving and generate fees, lenders started issuing subprime mortgages loans given to borrowers with poor credit histories, often with adjustable rates that spiked after a few years.
These highly risky loans were bundled, stamped with top-tier AAA safety ratings by compliant credit rating agencies, and sold globally.
When the underlying housing bubble finally burst and millions of homeowners defaulted on those subprime loans, the value of those complex securities plummeted.
Because the massive financial conglomerates were deeply interconnected through these toxic assets, the sudden collapse threatened the solvency of the entire global financial system.
The panic was total, and the government's response was unprecedented in scale. We saw massive bailouts of Wall Street firms through the Troubled Asset Relief Program, or TARP.
The Federal Reserve stepped in and pumped trillions of dollars of liquidity into the system, utilizing emergency powers not seen since the Depression.
The major financial institutions had grown so large and intertwined they were deemed too big to fail. Letting them collapse like the Knickerbocker Trust in 1907 would have annihilated the global economy.
The primary regulatory response to the 2008 crisis was the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act of 2010.
Dodd-Frank sought to rein in systemic risk by increasing the capital requirements for large banks, subjecting them to regular stress tests to ensure they could survive a severe recession, and creating the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau to regulate consumer financial products.
The debates surrounding Dodd-Frank remain highly polarized today. Proponents view it as an absolutely essential framework for risk containment that has made the system undeniably safer, while critics view it as an overly burdensome, complex compliance regime that stifles lending and restricts economic growth.
This regulatory push and pull brings us to the continuing volatility of the modern era.
We saw massive fiscal interventions and unprecedented monetary expansion by the Fed during the COVID-19 pandemic to keep the economy afloat. And then, quite suddenly in the spring of 2023, we experienced a spate of massive regional bank failures, most notably Silicon Valley Bank.
If we look closely at the mechanics of the regional bank failures of 2023, the historical parallels are striking and instructive.
While the technology was entirely modern, we had digital bank runs executed on phones and driven by panic spreading at the speed of light on social media, rather than crowds of men in top hats standing in a physical line on Wall Street. The fundamental structural issues were exactly the same as the panic of 1907 or the free banking era of the 1840s.
It all came back to the value of the assets backing the deposits.
Precisely. Silicon Valley Bank had invested heavily in long-term United States government bonds. When the Federal Reserve rapidly raised interest rates to fight inflation in 2022, the market value of those older, low-interest bonds plummeted.
This is a classic case of duration risk. It is the exact same exogenous shock mechanism that wiped out the free banks in the 1840s when state canal bonds lost their value.
When the depositors of Silicon Valley Bank realized the bank was sitting on massive, unrealized losses and might not have enough liquidity to cover withdrawals, they panicked.
It came down to a sudden loss of confidence, a severe liquidity mismatch, and a plunge in asset valuation.
It vividly demonstrates that the core physics of banking trust and liquidity do not change, regardless of the technological era.
As we move further into the 21st century, into an era of digital currency and decentralized finance, we are seeing new systems emerge that deliberately operate entirely outside this traditional, heavily regulated framework we've just spent the hour discussing.
And that is the final thought I want to leave you with, looking forward based on the history we've covered. When you examine the rise of cryptocurrencies, stablecoins, and decentralized finance platforms today, we are, in many structural ways, essentially recreating the free banking era of the 1840s.
We have private entities and decentralized protocols acting much like the old wildcat banks, issuing their own private digital notes and tokens, backed by widely varying degrees of collateral, existing largely outside the purview of a central bank or the FDIC.
We are forced to ask a profound question. Will cryptography and blockchain technology finally solve the fundamental problem of trust and liquidity in banking through pure mathematics? Or are we just inventing highly efficient, technologically advanced new ways to repeat the panic of 1907 on a global digital scale?
Thank you for joining me for this discussion.
Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.